Hi everyone, this is Dr. Joshua Schultz, and today I'll talk a little bit about assessing literacy development in the linguistically diverse classroom. Through this lecture, you will learn a little bit about the different kinds of assessment, how to identify them, what their purposes are, and some examples of them. You'll know that you have learned if you're able to engage with some scenarios and apply the content from the readings and from the lecture to show what you know. As we're getting started, I'd like you to discuss the following. This is on a Moodle post. I'd like you to first describe the reading assessments that you have used to determine any reading behaviors for any students that you have read with. You can just go ahead and use bullet points if you would like to list and describe in that format. If you have not used reading assessments before, which is perfectly okay, think about what kind of information about reading do you think would be useful to gather so you would know more about your students' literacy development as a teacher. Okay? After you've made that initial post, give everyone about a week to do so. Make a response to some of your classmates' posts, at least two. Respond by providing additional assessments that may be beneficial, or comment through questions, confirmations, or extension of your thinking about what your classmates have posted. Let's begin with the content. We will now talk about three different kinds of assessment that appear in the literacy classroom. The first one is diagnostic assessment. A diagnostic assessment occurs prior to instruction, and its purpose is to assess students' needs, interests, and their current control of linguistic resources. Basically, that just means how are they using language or languages to make meaning. The second kind of assessment is formative. And a formative assessment occurs during or immediately after a lesson, and its purpose is to inform the next steps in instruction. The third type of assessment that we will discuss is summative assessment. Summative assessment occurs following a unit of instruction, and it is the purpose of summative assessment is to assess student progress towards the unit objectives, both the learning and the language objectives. Let's go deeper into each of these. Diagnostic assessment, as I mentioned, involves collecting information at the beginning of a unit of study to gauge students' current understanding of a topic. It provides instructional focus for the teacher, it provides learning focus for the students, and it also reveals misconceptions that students may have about the topic that the teacher can address. Some examples of diagnostic assessment include, but are not limited to, tests of phonological awareness, or the Yop-Singer test of phoneme segmentation. The second type of assessment, or the second category of assessment, is formative assessment. Formative assessment is defined as the gathering of information about student learning during the progression of a course or program, and it usually happens repeatedly to improve the learning of those students. So, we want to think about assessment for learning. For learning is formative assessment. Okay? So formative assessment pinpoints students' difficulties and measures their student learning progress throughout the unit. Some examples include your observation, which should never be discounted as a professional. You are the number one assessor of students' literacy development, and that happens through teacher observation. You may also ask students to journal. You may also collect exit tickets at the end of a lecture, Exit tickets do not have to be graded. They just have to be looked at and thoughtfully considered by the teacher. You may have use running records. You may conduct a miscue analysis. You may conduct audio recordings of students reading aloud. You may create portfolios, learning logs, whiteboards, visual representations, etc. Many different forms of formative assessment are available to inform your instruction. The third category of assessment is summative assessment. And summative assessment typically is probably the assessment that someone out of education would be able to talk about. Right? These are the high stakes tests that are they're kind of nerve-wracking for teachers, a little nerve-wracking for students. But their definition of a summative assessment is the gathering of information about student learning at the end of a unit to measure progress toward unit, class, and goals. Their purpose involves accountability, wanting to make sure that the teacher was addressing the standards and benchmarks that were identified by Common Core state standards or national standards or state standards. You want to use summative assessment practices in order to assess the effectiveness of a particular program and overall student progress. Not individual student progress, but overall student progress. Some examples include the WIDA Access or the PARC assessment. WIDA Access is for ESOL. PARC assessment is a national assessment. Okay. Summative assessments sometimes get a bad rap because they are used as high stakes. Sometimes they can be used punitively towards teachers if teachers don't have enough students who are making yearly annual progress. The teacher may be denied a raise or an evaluation, or a good evaluation rather. A school may receive a quote-unquote failing grade. These kind of measures are not the purpose of a summative assessment, and they have caused a bit of controversy in the world of education that I'm sure that you are a bit aware of at this point. We can discuss more of that. There are some special considerations for students who are English learners or special education students when it comes to assessment. We may consider some alternative practices for assessment. Things like authentic assessment includes ways that we can create ways to understand learning by actually assessing a student in a way that is very much connected to their own daily life. Okay, so say for example you are assessing I'll give an example, the persuasive writing practices of a third grade student who is a SPED student. Perhaps you write with that student a short letter in which the student asks maybe for some kind of different food in the cafeteria, and you work with the student to construct that particular letter that is persuasive in the fact that it gives an overview of the issue and gives some reasons why that particular food should be included in the cafeteria, and then it is actually given to someone who may be able to affect change. I just thought about that off the top of my head, so that might not be the best example of authentic assessment. But basically, it's keeping it real when it's assessment time. Okay? There are, of course, nonverbal assessments, portfolio assessments, in which you are using the learning and the standards and the learning objectives, and you to guide your assessment, and students are included in the practice of deciding which portfolio items will be used to show their growth over time in a portfolio. Access is a test of English language learning development. Genre assessment is basically how students are developing in their writing across the genres, whether they're learning how to argue or persuade or to discuss multiple genres. So I've also included in this module a website from Vanderbilt University, which discusses a number of cats. Meow, not those kind of cats, no. These are classroom assessment techniques. I want you to take some time to explore this website. And as you're exploring, let the following sentence starters guide your thinking. Think about something you like, something you might use, something you already use, or something that you might adapt for your classroom. There are a number of classroom assessment techniques listed. There are also a number of links connected on the page. Okay, so you can really spend some time exploring. I know that there are links from Iowa State University, Vanderbilt, and a number of leading educational institutions that are looking at classroom assessment techniques. Now, on to some scenarios. So there are 3 scenarios, and in each of these scenarios, I would like you to consider each scenario what you've learned about assessment and in the course readings. I want you to think about what kind of assessment it is, what might the teacher learn from the assessment, and does the assessment accomplish the intended purpose? And why or why not? And what alternative forms of assessment might you suggest that would accomplish the same purpose? Scenario 1. In scenario 1, Mrs. Warthog teaches 2nd grade. Before beginning a unit on informational text, she has students work in pairs to label different text features of a science chapter book. Pause now and think about what kind of assessment it is. What might the teacher learn from the assessment? Does the assessment accomplish the intended purpose? And what alternative forms of assessment might you suggest? And then move on. Scenario 2 includes Mr. Tuckerman, who teaches 3rd grade. He has a unit on reptiles in which he shows a brief video about the habitats of reptiles. Following the video presentation, he asks students to turn and talk about the habitat of reptiles. He then asks students to share out 3 things that they have learned about reptile habitats. Think about that. What is the purpose of that? What kind of assessment is it? What is purpose? How is the teacher using it? And how might it be changed? Think about these questions. Pause, and then move on to the next. 3rd scenario involves a 4th grade taking the National Assessment of Educational Progress on an annual basis. This test measures students' progress in such areas as reading, writing, math, and civics. The results of this test are not tied to individual students, classrooms, or school districts. However, the information is used to gain an understanding of how students at varying grade levels are performing nationwide and within certain states. Same thing. Use the guiding questions to think about it. Pause, and then move on. Okay, now it's time to assess your own learning. As you engage with the scenarios, were you able to identify the different types of assessment? Maybe you thought, well, it depends on the context, and you needed some follow-up. Well, yes, these are artificial contexts that I kind of made up from my own experience, and there may be different details that could lead you down a different path, but that's okay. If you're able to identify in general that there was diagnostic, informative, and summative assessments, then you've done well. Okay? Identify, as an exit ticket, I'd like you to make note of this. You don't have to submit this, but I want you to think about, can you identify 3 forms of assessment and their purpose? Can you think about 2 examples of formative assessment that are typically found in elementary literacy classrooms, perhaps from the CATS website? And can you think of 1 question that is lingering that you have concerning assessment? Send that on to me. Thanks so much for participating in this lecture and listening, and I appreciate your